The smell of burnt coffee filled the kitchen before I even realized the pot had been sitting there for hours. Outside, the wind came hard off the fields, shaking the maples that lined Maple Street and scattering yellow leaves across the porch like bits of an old photograph. The house had gone quiet since the funeral. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that sinks into the walls, the kind that remembers things you'd rather forget. Every sound, the clock, the pipes, the faint hum of the refrigerator felt like it was waiting for something that wasn't coming back. I turned down the stove and watched the last curl of steam fade into nothing. Behind me, her voice cut through the silence, steady, careful, but sharp at the edges. Emily. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. She spoke about the money, about the house, about how I'd kept her trapped in a life too small for the person she wanted to become. Her words hit harder because they weren't wrong, not entirely. But there are some truths that sound cruel when you're too young to understand the reason behind them. I could see her reflection in the window eyes, bright with anger, and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. I didn't move, didn't answer. Just watched the leaves swirl through the cold light outside and thought this is how distance begins. Not with shouting, but with silence that no one knows how to break. The smell of burnt coffee filled the kitchen before I even realized the pot had been sitting there for hours. The house had grown quiet since the funeral, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the walls and makes every sound feel heavier. Outside, the late autumn wind shook the maples lining Maple Street, sending yellow leaves tumbling across the porch. Emily stood by the counter, her arms folded. The kitchen light flickered above her, catching the sharp edge of her eyes. She had her mother's eyes full of light when she was kind, and full of fire when she wasn't. That day, it was all fire. She said I'd wasted the insurance money, that I couldn't let go of a dying house in a town that had forgotten us. Her voice cracked halfway through, and she turned away before I could see her face. I wanted to tell her how the money went to her mother's last hospital bill, how I'd sold my old Chevy to keep the lights on, and her tuition paid when the scholarship fell through. But I didn't. Sometimes the truth sounds too much like an excuse. She slammed her hand on the table. I could hear the tremor in it. I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles went white. For a moment, something inside me wanted to shout back, to remind her of all the nights I'd driven to the hospital after work, or all the times I skipped meals so she could have what she needed. But the words stayed behind my teeth. When she said she was leaving, I asked her where she'd go. She said anywhere but here. Her voice was low, flat, the kind of tone that leaves no room for a second chance. I said she didn't have to want me, that I'd still be her father. She didn't answer. She picked up her coat and walked out. The screen door slammed against the frame, and the sound of it echoed down the hall long after she was gone. Through the kitchen window, I watched her car roll down the driveway, the taillights glowing red through the fog. She didn't look back. I waited there until the sound of the engine faded into the wind. The cup in my hand was shaking. I set it down not gently. It cracked against the counter coffee, spilling across the old linoleum. I wiped it up slowly with a dish towel that still smelled faintly of her mother's perfume. After she left, the house felt smaller. The clock over the stove ticked too loud, the floorboards sighed with every step, and the smell of old engine grease clung to the air like guilt. I sat down at the table where she used to do her homework, the wood still marked with faint scratches from her pen. I pulled open the top drawer and found a birthday card I'd bought weeks earlier. I started writing, hoping the words would fill the silence. "Happy birthday, Em. I hope you're warm where you are." It looked wrong on the page, too empty. I kept writing anyway. Told her I missed her laugh, the one that used to echo through this kitchen when her mother baked pies on Sundays. I told her the town hadn't changed much except for the part of it that used to feel like home. When I finished, I folded the card carefully and slid it back into the drawer beside a stack of unpaid bills and the letter from the insurance company I never opened. Days passed. Then weeks. Winter came early that year. The frost crept across the windows like thin white veins. I kept working at the garage, fixing the same old trucks for the same old men who pretended not to pity me. At night, I'd make 1 cup of coffee and pour a second just to see the steam rise from it. Then I'd pour that second cup down the sink when it went cold. It made the silence a little easier to bear. Sometimes I'd hear her in my head, her voice sharp and certain, telling me I held her back. Maybe she was right. Maybe a man like me was meant to be a stepping stone, not a father figure. I told myself that as long as she was happy, I could live with being forgotten. One evening I sat on the porch, listening to the church bell from down the street ring in the wind. The sound carried through the air like an old habit refusing to die. Across the yard, the chair her mother used to sit in was still by the garden, its paint peeling the seat half-rotted. I never had the heart to throw it away. Every time I looked at it, I could almost see her there again, shelling peas, humming under her breath, telling me that someday Emily would understand. The next morning, the mailman left a thick envelope on my porch. My name was written across the front in her handwriting, neat and careful, the same way she used to label her school folders when she was 12. I carried it inside, sat at the table, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a wedding invitation. Heavy cream paper, the kind that leaves a powdery film on your fingers. The words were printed in gold: Emily Hargrove and Andrew Keller request the honor of your presence. I stopped reading there. The list of names below meant nothing to me strangers who would call her family now. At the bottom, written in pen, not print, was one short line. Please don't come. The light through the window shifted, catching the edge of the card. I folded it once and held it in my palm until it warmed to my skin. Then I placed it in the drawer beside the birthday card and the unpaid bills. The drawer groaned as I pushed it shut, as if even the wood had grown tired of holding so much that was unsaid. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though I knew I wouldn't drink it. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the church bell again, faint, but clear. I looked toward the garden at the empty chair under the tree and thought about how silence has a way of speaking louder than words ever could. When the clock struck noon, I turned off the coffee pot and sat in the kitchen just listening to the house breathe. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for answers. The kind you learn to live with. The morning light came in thin and cold, slipping through the blinds, like a quiet question I didn't want to answer. The invitation sat in the drawer, but I didn't have to open it to know the words by heart. Please don't come. I told myself I'd stay home. I said it again just to make it sound true. The house didn't argue. The clock ticked steady on the wall, the same rhythm that had marked every hour since she left. I washed the coffee pot, filled it again, watched the steam rise and fade. My hand drifted toward the truck keys hanging by the door. I could almost hear the creak of the seat, the familiar cough of the engine in winter air. By the time I realized what I was doing, I was already backing down the driveway. The road stretched out ahead flat and straight, the same 2 lanes that carried her to college years ago. I kept my hands on the wheel and let the miles think for me. The fields thinned as the city grew closer. The skyline rose like something alive, tall glass towers catching the pale sun. The air smelled different here, sharper, colder, with too much movement for a man used to silence. I parked half a block from the church. The building was all stone and glass, proud and clean, the kind of place my wife used to tear from wedding magazines and say one day Emily should have. For a moment I saw her there again, sitting on our old couch, turning the glossy pages, smiling faintly at things she would never have. Across the street, I stood under a bare tree, with my hands buried deep in my coat pockets. The ground was damp with half-melted snow, and the air had that electric stillness before a storm. Guests arrived one by one, well-dressed and comfortable, the kind of people who knew where to stand. When the limousine rolled up, heads turned. The driver hurried around to open the door, and Emily stepped out into the wind. She looked like her mother, same way of holding her chin high when nervous, same flicker of laughter that could still reach across distance. The dress shimmered faintly under the dull sky, too bright for this colorless street. For a second, she glanced across the road, not at me, but near enough. My chest tightened, as if her gaze brushed past. Then she turned back toward the church steps, surrounded by bridesmaids and flashes of white flowers. She looked happy. That was supposed to be enough. I stayed until the heavy doors closed behind her, the muffled sound of the organ barely reaching me. I found a small cafe a block away, glass windows fogged from the heat inside. A young barista with short hair asked if I wanted something stronger than coffee. I told her black was fine. She looked me over with polite curiosity. "You waiting for someone?" she asked. I said no, though the word didn't feel honest. From my seat by the window, I could see the church through a faint film of condensation. The ceremony lasted longer than I expected. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and careless. When the doors finally opened, laughter spilled into the street, bright and short-lived. Emily came out holding the arm of a tall man in a dark suit. Confetti and petals scattered at their feet. She tilted her head up to him and said something I couldn't hear, but I could see how he smiled back. There was pride in it, the kind a man wears when he thinks he's found something worth keeping. I didn't stay to see them drive off. Some things are better left half seen. The parking lot behind the church was still busy, engines idling, exhaust curling up in gray ribbons. Near the far edge, a black SUV sat dead, still hood open, hazard lights blinking in the snow. An older man in an expensive coat stood beside it, muttering to himself as he jabbed at his phone. I walked over and asked if he needed help. He looked up quickly. Startled eyes, sharp, but kind. Said it wouldn't start. New battery, new plugs, no clue why. I listened to the faint click when he turned the key, and knew right away. A loose connection, simple as that. I asked if I could look. He nodded, relieved, but wary. The suit, the ring, the voice, everything about him said he wasn't used to waiting. I leaned over the engine, tightened the cable, brushed a bit of frost from the edge, told him to try again. The SUV started smooth, the sound clean and steady. He smiled, grateful, pulling out his wallet before I could stop him. I told him not to bother. Just a bad connection, I said. Happens more than you think. He laughed, the tension leaving his shoulders. Said something about being late to his son's reception, about how his wife would kill him if she knew he'd stalled out. The name he gave was Keller. The word caught in my mind for a moment, echoing off the printed letters of that invitation at home. I wished him well, turned, and walked back to my truck before he could ask my name. The drive home felt longer. The sun was falling behind the towers, and by the time I reached the open road again, the light had gone soft and pink along the horizon. I stopped once for gas, nodded to the attendant, who didn't look up from his phone, and kept going. Back in town, the neon diner sign buzzed faintly against the evening sky. I took my usual stool by the window. The place smelled of bacon and burnt coffee. The game on the TV played without sound. Linda filled my mug without asking. She looked at me a moment, her eyes searching for something polite to say. Word had already made its way through town. "You didn't go," she said quietly. I stirred the coffee, watched the swirl of cream fade into black. "Sometimes showing up means staying away," I told her. She didn't answer, just refilled my cup and gave a small nod before walking off. The clatter of dishes and low murmur of voices filled the space that followed. Later that night, I sat at the same kitchen table, the drawer still heavy with the weight of unsent words. I took out a new card, clean and white. The pen felt cold between my fingers. I wrote 3 words, and nothing else. "I'm still here." I stared at them until they stopped looking like words and started to feel like a confession. I folded the card carefully, slid it into the drawer beside the first, and let my hand rest there a moment longer. The wood was warm under my palm, as if the house itself remembered. I thought about opening the drawer again, about reading what I'd written before, but I didn't. Outside, a car passed down Maple Street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the walls before vanishing into the dark. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the kind that waits steady and patient, like a promise that hasn't given up yet. The wind pressed softly against the windows that morning, carrying the scent of rain and thawing earth. Spring was trying to find its way back, though the house still felt heavy with winter. Dust floated in the air, catching in the narrow beams of light that fell across the kitchen floor. It was time to clean, or maybe I just needed something to keep my hands busy. I started with the closets, pulling down boxes I hadn't opened in years. Old tax papers, photographs, things too sentimental to throw away, but too painful to look at. Each box carried a life I used to have. I worked in silence until the air turned thick with the smell of cardboard and dust. In the bedroom, I found her jewelry box on the top shelf. The wood was worn smooth at the corners, the latch loose from years of use. When I opened it, the faintest trace of her perfume drifted out, something floral and soft, still clinging to the lining. Inside lay a tangle of thin chains, a few earrings missing their pairs, and in the center, her wedding ring. I hadn't touched it since the day before her last surgery. The gold felt lighter than I remembered, as if time had hollowed it out. I turned it in my fingers, watching how it caught the light. Then I saw the engraving inside words so small, they almost disappeared. "If you doubt your father's love, look closer." I froze, reading it again, slower this time. Those words weren't meant for me. She'd had them carved there for Emily, probably without ever telling me. It felt like she'd spoken straight from the past, her voice steady and certain as always. I sat on the edge of the bed, the ring warm in my palm, and let the memories come. The hospital nights, the way the machines hummed while she slept, how I'd sold my old Chevy to pay the last bill, the insurance money that didn't stretch far enough. I remembered signing papers with trembling hands, thinking I could fix it all if I just stayed quiet. I told no one. Not her, not Emily. Pride, I thought, is just another way of holding pain where no one can see it. By the time I finished cleaning, the house looked no different, just emptier. I carried the ring to the kitchen and set it on the counter beside my coffee mug. Sunlight touched it, turning the metal warm and alive. I thought about calling Emily. The phone sat on the table, dark and waiting. My hand hovered over it before I pulled away. Some conversations need the right season, and ours hadn't come yet. I grabbed my jacket and drove to the diner. The bell above the door chimed the same way it always did, sharp and small. 2 men sat near the window, their voices low but clear enough to follow. They were talking about the payout from my wife's insurance, about how I'd spent it all, and left my daughter with nothing. I stopped just inside the doorway, my back to them. Their words didn't sound angry, just certain, the kind of certainty that only comes from not knowing the truth. I felt the heat crawl up my neck. My hand brushed the counter, knocking a spoon against the glass. Linda looked up from behind the register. "You all right, Tom?" I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Just coffee." She poured it without another word, but her eyes said she'd heard too. I wrapped my fingers around the cup, the heat burning into my skin. For a moment I almost turned, almost said something. But what would it change? People believe what makes sense. Silence is easier to keep than it is to break. I left a few bills on the counter and walked out before finishing the coffee. The afternoon air was cold again, the kind that carries sound farther than it should. The clouds hung low, and somewhere in the distance thunder rolled like a warning. I drove home with the windows cracked, letting the wind cool my face. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, smaller maybe, or just more honest. The windows caught the gray light, dull and uneven. Inside, the ring still sat on the counter where I'd left it. I picked it up and held it close to my eyes. The engraving shimmered faintly in the fading light. "If you doubt your father's love, look closer." I wondered how many times Emily had doubted. Maybe every time she looked at a bill with my name on it. Maybe the day she packed her bags and left. I'd given her every reason to misunderstand me. You can't expect someone to see the truth when you hide it out of pride. I walked to the bedroom and opened the nightstand drawer. 2 birthday cards lay there, yellowed at the edges. The ink faded, but legible. I took out a new one, smooth and white, and began to write. "You were always the best thing I built." The pen scratched softly against the paper. The words looked too small for what I meant, but I left them as they were. I blew on the ink until it dried, and slid the card into the drawer beside the others. The air in the room felt heavier. I could hear the loose shutter outside tapping gently against the siding. The rhythm was steady, almost like breathing. I sat on the bed for a while, my hand resting on the drawer, feeling the wood warm under my palm. The light was fading fast. I turned toward the nightstand, the ring glinting faintly in the last rays of sun. I picked it up again and rolled it between my fingers. The gold caught the light one final time, reflecting it across the wall in a thin line that looked almost alive. For a second I thought I saw her there, just a flicker of her shadow, a memory caught in the motion of the light. I let the ring rest on the nightstand exactly where her watch used to be. The house settled around me, the air creaking softly as the temperature dropped. I lay back, listening to the wind move through the eaves, the faint hum of life still holding in the walls. Secrets, I thought, don't die in silence. They wait, they shift, and sometimes they shine just long enough for someone to finally see them. The shutter outside tapped once more, then stopped. The ring on the nightstand gleamed faintly in the dark, and the room filled with the quiet weight of things unsaid. The night was still holding its breath when I woke the faint sound of rain sliding across the tin roof. The smell of oil and rust still clung to my hands from the day before. I hadn't meant to fall asleep in the chair again, but lately the house seemed easier to face when the lights were low. Morning came slow, wrapped in fog. I walked to the garage, coffee steaming in one hand, keys in the other. The air inside was thick with heat and the metallic hum of waiting engines. Work had a way of keeping the ghosts quiet. Fixing machines was simple. You found the broken part, replaced it, and things ran again. People didn't work that way. Ethan was already there, hunched over a carburetor. He looked up when I came in, gave a short nod, then went back to it. The kid learned fast. I liked that about him. He talked too much sometimes, but silence made him uneasy. I understood. Silence used to make me uneasy, too. The day pressed down heavy and humid. Sweat crawled under my shirt as I leaned over the Ford's open hood. I'd just tightened a belt when the pain came. It was sharp and sudden right through the chest, as if someone had driven a nail through me. The wrench fell clanging against concrete, echoing in the small space. When I opened my eyes again, Ethan was crouched beside me, his face pale, his hands shaking. The smell of gasoline and dust filled the air. "You okay, Mr. H?" I pushed myself upright, slow, careful. My breath came in uneven pulls. "Just a little dizzy," I said. "You passed out," he muttered, still looking like he didn't trust the world to stay steady. I waved him off and sat there for a minute, letting the world find its shape again. That's when I saw it, a white envelope sitting neatly on the workbench, too clean for a place like this. Chicago postage. My name written in my daughter's handwriting, the same careful script that used to label her school notebooks. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside was a check crisp, and folded once, and a single line written in ink. "I don't want to owe you." The letters were straight, precise. No apology, no warmth, just distance. Ethan came closer, curiosity written all over him. "That from your kid," I nodded, still staring at the check. The paper looked out of place in my hands. He frowned. "You gonna cash it?" I walked to the workbench lamp, the light hitting the page like a small sun. My hand hovered there for a moment, the flame waiting. "Some debts," I said, "are heavier if you put a number on them." The check caught quickly. The edge blackened, curling inward. I watched the fire trace her handwriting before turning it to ash. The reflection of the flame shimmered on the wall, flickering like something alive, and for a second I saw her face there, young again, laughing beside her mother in the kitchen. Then it was gone. Ethan handed me a rag, quiet now. Neither of us spoke again for the rest of the day. The hum of tools was enough. That night, thunder rolled over the hills, slow and heavy. I sat by the kitchen window, the world outside blurred by rain. The drawer in my room waited full of cards and silence. But tonight I didn't open it. Instead, I reached for my wife's old pocket watch, the one she said she'd give to Emily when the time was right. The metal was cool in my hand, the hinge creaking softly when I flipped it open. The hands had long stopped moving, but the engraving on the back still caught the light. "It's never too late." She'd said those words often, sometimes about fixing a mistake, sometimes about forgiveness. I turned the watch over again, thinking maybe it was time for both. I found some brown paper on the shelf and wrapped it neatly. The act itself felt like prayer. I wrote my daughter's married name and city, the ink pressing too deep into the paper. I sat for a long while before sealing it. The rain softened to a drizzle, and I could hear the faint hum of the town through the wet air. The next morning, I drove to the post office. Inside, the smell of ink and cardboard hit me like memory. A young clerk with earbuds in barely looked up when I placed the package on the counter. His music leaked through a faint rhythm from another world. He weighed it, typed something into the computer, then slid it into a bin without ceremony. The package disappeared behind a wall of white envelopes. "Anything fragile, sir?" he asked absently. "Not anymore," I said. The door chimed behind me as I stepped out into the gray light. The sky was clearing, but the air still carried the scent of rain. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching people move in and out, their lives light and unburdened. Then I turned back toward home. Weeks passed. The pain in my chest faded, replaced by the ache of something slower. Work filled the hours. Ethan stayed around helping when he wasn't at school. He talked less now, as if he understood that some silences deserve respect. One afternoon he came running in with his phone in hand, face tight. "Mr. H, you need to see this." He held it out. A news clip played. The courthouse steps in Chicago, cameras flashing. My daughter walking fast through the crowd, her eyes red, her jaw set hard. The headline said she'd withdrawn from a major case. Words like meltdown and controversy scrolled underneath. I watched her brush past reporters, a hand raised to block their questions. Her face looked older, sharper. But beneath the anger, I saw something else. A crack, a flicker of pain she couldn't hide. Ethan glanced at me, unsure. "That your daughter?" I nodded. "You think she's okay?" I didn't answer. My throat felt dry. I remembered her as a child, standing on a kitchen stool stirring pancake batter while her mother laughed. The sound of her voice reading aloud from a school book, the way she'd once held my hand without thinking. "She's figuring something out," I said finally. Ethan looked like he wanted to ask more, but didn't. He went back to the workbench, pretending to clean tools. The rain started again, light but steady. The world outside turned gray, the kind of gray that carries peace instead of sorrow. I looked up at the roof, listening to the soft rhythm of water against metal. Somewhere in that city, a brown paper package was probably opened. Inside, a broken watch rested in a stranger's hands. Maybe she turned it over, read the words her mother chose, and felt something shift. It's never too late. The garage lights flickered once, then steadied. I stood there, the smell of oil and rain wrapping around me. Outside, the storm rolled past the horizon, slow and unhurried, like forgiveness finding its way home. The storm had rolled past, but the world still smelled of rain and metal. The air hung heavy, a quiet that didn't feel like peace, but like the pause before something else began. I stood in the garage doorway, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the puddles settle into the cracks of the old concrete. The light outside was dull and silver, the kind that makes every reflection look like memory. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked loud enough to sound like breathing. I busied myself with small things that didn't need doing, wiping wrenches already clean, rearranging bolts by size, pretending I didn't notice the way the silence pressed against the walls. Some part of me knew something was happening far from here. It wasn't logic, just the kind of feeling that comes from blood and distance. I imagined her in her apartment, tall windows overlooking the river, everything polished and still. She would have unwrapped the package like someone opening a letter from a life she didn't want to remember. Her mother's watch, old brass, glinting in the light. I could almost see her turning it in her hand, her mouth tightening, that spark of anger rising before anything gentler had a chance. Maybe she'd noticed the engraving first. "It's never too late." I whispered the words to myself, almost afraid they might already be untrue. Then I pictured the rest, the sound of metal slipping, the small snap as the hinge gave way. I hadn't remembered leaving anything inside that watch, but time keeps its own secrets. Out would have fallen. A folded hospital invoice edges yellowed my name at the bottom, where the insurance had stopped, and I had kept signing anyway. I couldn't have known it for sure, but I liked to think it went that way. Maybe she stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. Maybe she saw the dates, the amount, the signature too familiar now that she was older. And maybe curiosity or guilt, though I'd never want to believe she felt, that drove her to the address printed on that paper. The hospital would look different now. New paint, new name, same ghosts. The nurse at the records desk might still be there, the one with white hair, who spoke softly like she'd learned the sound of bad news too many times. I pictured her remembering that night, The man in the grease-stained jacket signing away his savings without looking at the total, saying something stupid like, "I'll figure out retirement later as long as my girls have a shot." She would have told Emily that story. I know she would have. That night I couldn't settle. The air carried a weight that wasn't just weather. I sat by the kitchen table, my hands still smelling faintly of oil, the rain whispering on the roof. I thought about that package moving through the city, passing from one pair of hands to another until it reached hers. I pictured her spreading things out on her table, old bills, college statements, unanswered emails, trying to piece together the man she thought she knew. Maybe she started typing an email, then the kind that takes more courage to finish than to begin. Dad, I was wrong. The words felt almost real in my mind, like I could hear her saying them. But pride's a hard habit to break. I could see her hesitate, rereading it, watching the cursor blink until the screen blurred. Then one small click, and the words were gone again. The rain picked up outside, a steady rhythm that filled the house. I turned off the lamp, sat in the dark, and listened to it move across the roof like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and slow, the sound of the next storm building. The radio had said it was headed our way, a once-in-a-decade kind of thing. But storms don't follow calendars. They just know where they're needed. I went to the window. The wind had started to bend the trees, and lightning flickered behind the clouds like the pulse of something alive. I imagined her standing by her own window at that same moment, phone in her hand, thinking about calling. Maybe she even typed the number. Maybe she heard my voice in her head and didn't know what to say. The lights flickered once, then held. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant echo of thunder over the hills. I thought about that watch again, the way it must have felt in her hands, warm from her touch, heavy with what it carried. That watch had waited years in the dark for the right hands to open it. It's never too late. I said it again under my breath, softer this time, afraid of the silence that followed. By midnight, the storm was close enough to make the windows rattle. The air smelled like wet earth and lightning. I checked the flashlight, then sat back down, elbows on the table, head tilted toward the sound of rain. The house creaked under the wind, but it held. Old things tend to, if they've been built with care. I closed my eyes, listening to the storm crawl over the town. In that noise, I could almost hear her breathing. I don't know if it was memory or hope, but it felt real enough to believe. The roof shuddered once, the kind of deep sound that moves through bone. And for a heartbeat, I could almost hear her voice carried on the rain. The storm came heavy that night, loud enough to make the walls breathe. Rain slammed against the glass, rolling down in sheets that blurred the world outside. The wind moaned through the alley like something alive. Inside, the lights flickered twice, then steadied into a thin, trembling glow. I stood by the window, coffee untouched on the counter. The sky flashed white and purple, and for a moment I saw my reflection in the glass, older than I remembered, shoulders bent like the roof above me. The rain hit harder, and somewhere in the house, something creaked the way old wood does before it gives. Then came the smell. Not smoke yet, just the dry, bitter warning of it. A second later, I saw the thin thread of gray slipping down from the vent. Lightning must have found the attic. I moved fast, or as fast as a man my age could. Grabbed the fire extinguisher, the phone, anything that felt useful. The floor was slick under my boots. The air turned heavy. Then through the roar of the storm came another sound, faint but clear. Mr. H. It was Ethan's voice, cutting through the rain. I shouted back, but the wind swallowed my words. He must have come to check on me. Damn kid. Brave or foolish, maybe both. The smoke thickened. Flames crawled down from the ceiling, snapping through the wooden beams like dry twigs. Heat pressed at my back, and every breath burned. I dropped low and started toward the front door. Halfway there, a crash stopped me. The ceiling had given way, blocking the exit in a storm of dust and fire. Through the wreckage, I could see Ethan, his face pale in the orange light, one arm up against the falling ash. "Move back," I rasped. "Go around the side." He hesitated, shaking his head. "Do it. Now." He disappeared into the rain. I turned for the kitchen, lungs tight, heart hammering against my ribs. The house groaned again, each sound deeper, closer. Smoke filled the hallway, turning the familiar into shadows. I reached the back door just as another beam cracked above me. For a second, everything stilled, heat, noise, time itself. Then the floor buckled, and I went down hard. As I fell, I saw it, the old armchair by the window, the one her mother used to sit in when Emily was small, reading by the lamp. For one heartbeat, it looked untouched, framed in light and memory. Then the floor gave way, and it vanished into the fire. Pain exploded through my side. The world narrowed to heat and orange light. I tried to stand, but my legs screamed in protest. Somewhere above me, someone was shouting my name, and behind that, sirens, sharp, rising, desperate. I closed my eyes against the smoke, the noise, the ache in my chest. Through it all came the steady hiss of rain against flame. Fire in the rain. Hands pulled at me, then rough but steady. Voices shouted orders I couldn't catch. The cold bit deep when they carried me outside, rain hitting my face like needles. I caught one last glimpse of the house roof caving in, light spilling upward like a confession. "Stay with us, sir." I tried, but the world went gray around the edges. When I woke again, everything was white. The air smelled of antiseptic and damp linen. A monitor beeped somewhere near my head, steady and patient. The pain was distant, buried under layers of medication and fog. A nurse leaned over me, calm and kind. She said something about lucky timing, about how the neighbor boy had called it in just in time. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant by lucky. Time folded in strange ways after that. I drifted in and out, half dreaming of the storm of fire and rain and faces blurred by smoke. Once I heard Ethan's voice at the door, tired but alive. He said my name to someone, then Emily's. There was a long pause before the sound of a phone clicking shut. Later hours, maybe days, I woke to the quiet sound of footsteps. Not hurried, not afraid. Just steady. The nurse's voice came soft. "He's awake off and on. You can sit with him." Then silence followed by a breath I knew before I opened my eyes. I turned my head slowly. The room swam into focus, pale walls, soft light through the blinds. Emily sat by the bed, her raincoat hanging off the chair, hair pulled back like she was trying to hold herself together. Her hands were clasped so tight her knuckles showed white. On the chair beside her lay a half-burned notebook, its pages curled and darkened at the edges. One line had survived, crooked but readable. She was always the best thing I ever built. She stared at it for a long time before she realized I was awake. "Did you find what was left?" I whispered. Her head lifted, eyes wide and wet. She didn't speak at first, just reached out. Her hand trembled when it met mine. "I found more than I deserved, Dad." That word Dad broke something quiet inside me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. We sat like that, the machines keeping rhythm for both of us. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the years we had lost. She looked at the notebook again, then at me. You wrote that before the fire, she said softly. I nodded. Some things even fire can't erase. Her eyes flicked to the small tray table beside my bed. The pocket watch sat there blackened around the edges, the engraving still catching the light. She reached for it, thumb brushing the words. It's never too late. Her voice barely a whisper, but it was enough. Outside, the rain had started again, soft this time, gentle against the window pane. Each drop sounded like the next second finding its way back to life. The rhythm matched her breathing beside me, steady and real. For the first time in years, I let the sound carry me. I didn't think about the house, or the pain, or the things lost to flame. Only the rain, the faint ticking of the watch, and the warmth of her hand in mine. The world outside kept moving, but in that small hospital room, time finally held still. Morning light in the hospital came soft and clean, the kind that made everything look temporary. I woke to the low hum of machines and the faint clatter of a food cart rolling past the door. My legs ached. My chest felt like it had been filled with gravel, but I was still here. That was enough. Physical therapy started early. 2 steps to the door, 3 back to the bed. Each morning I learned how to stand again, how to trust bones that had forgotten their work. The therapist was patient, the kind who smiled without pity. She said recovery was slow at my age, and I told her I'd been slow my whole life. That made her laugh, and laughter made the pain easier to bear. Emily came most afternoons carrying coffee I wasn't supposed to drink, and updates I didn't ask for, but wanted anyway. She always looked like she had one foot still in the city, the other trying to find a place here. Some days she talked about work. Other days she just sat and let the silence do the talking. One afternoon she stood by the window, arms folded. Her voice was quiet when she said, "The house is gone. They took it all down. Nothing left but the chimney." I closed my eyes and pictured the slab, the empty lot, the ghosts that must have slipped free when the walls fell. "Maybe it's better that way," I said. "Some things aren't meant to be rebuilt." She didn't answer. Her fingers twisted the strap of her purse the way her mother used to twist her wedding ring when she was thinking too hard. "What will you do now?" she asked. I had been turning that question over for days. "I might sell what's left," I said. "Sign the garage over to Ethan. Maybe head somewhere warmer, somewhere that doesn't remember me." She looked out at the parking lot. The reflection of the blinds striped her face like shadows on old film. "You'd really leave," she said. "If there's nothing left to fix, maybe it's time I answered." The next morning, Ethan came by with soot still under his nails. He'd been cleaning what the fire hadn't claimed. Emily had gone with him, helping sort boxes from the garage that somehow survived. When they returned, she walked into my room holding something long and rolled. "We found this," she said. She unrolled the paper across my lap. My handwriting stared back at me, blue ink over faded lines. It took a second for me to remember. The expansion plan. A bigger garage, a classroom, a space for kids to learn trades. At the top, in uneven letters, I'd written her name. Emily's Place, Community Garage and Learning Center. Her voice was barely more than breath. "You were going to name it after me?" I shrugged the motion slow and small. Figured kids who needed a second chance should know your name, too. She stared at the words, eyes shining in a way that wasn't entirely from tears. "You were planning this all that time." "I didn't get to it," I said. "Time ran faster than I thought." She smoothed the paper with her hand, then looked at me with a spark I hadn't seen since she was 17, and arguing about curfews. "If you sell that lot, it won't be out of guilt," she said. "What are you thinking, Em? I'm thinking this town still owes you more than whispers. I'm thinking maybe I do too. We can rebuild this, not just for you, but for everyone who needs a place to start over." I studied her face, the mix of steel and grace that belonged to both her mother and herself. "You'll have to deal with the city," I said. "Permit zoning, all that red tape." She smiled just a little. "I've faced judges twice your age. I think I can handle a permit clerk." That made me laugh, and it hurt, but in the good way. Weeks passed. My body stitched itself back together in slow silence. Meanwhile, she worked back and forth between city offices, the lot, and my bedside. Ethan kept her company, and word spread through town faster than I expected. Old neighbors dropped by with stories and tools. Someone left a pie at the hospital front desk with no note. The hardware store donated a box of wrenches. A retired mechanic offered to help teach once the place opened. One evening, Ethan came by, hair wild, grin wide. "The foundation's in," he said. "Concrete's solid." Emily yelled at a supplier till they doubled the delivery. I think she scares people in a good way. I smiled. She gets that from her mother. When the day finally came for me to leave the hospital, the nurse wheeled me outside into sunlight so bright it hurt. Emily stood by the truck, holding the keys. "Where to?" she asked. "You tell me." She drove. I watched the town slide by, the diner, the church, the grocery store that still had my old photo on the wall. People turned when they saw us. Some waved. Some just nodded. It felt strange being seen again. We stopped at the edge of town. Where the garage used to stand, something new gleamed against the light. Clean white siding, glass windows, and a wooden sign hung fresh above the door. Emily's place, built on second chances. For a while, neither of us spoke. I gripped the cane, letting the sound of laughter spill out through the open doors. Inside, kids in borrowed coveralls stood around a car engine, while Ethan explained something, his hands moving quick, his voice calm. A girl held a wrench like it was the first real thing she'd ever owned. "Thomas, you coming in?" Emily asked. I looked at the building, at the people, at her. "You did this." She shook her head. "We did. You just gave it a name. We walked inside together. The smell of oil and sawdust hit me like an old song." Ethan nodded from across the bay. "Took you long enough," he said. "Road was rough," I told him. He laughed, turned back to the kids. "Keep steady," he said. "Don't rush it. The engine always tells you when it's ready." I smiled. He'd been listening all along. Outside, the wind moved soft through the trees, stirring the dust in slow circles. The afternoon sun caught the paint on the sign, turning it gold for a heartbeat. Emily handed me a paper cup of coffee. "Careful, it's hot," she said. I took a sip, spilled a few drops on my sleeve. She laughed, and for once I didn't rush to wipe it off. The stain looked a lot like living. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded low and steady, rolling past the edge of town. The sound faded into the wind, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like leaving. I just stood there watching the world rebuild itself one breath at a time. Spring came slow that year, melting the last of the snow off the highway behind my cabin. The air smelled of wet earth and oil from the garage down the street. Most mornings I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling beside me, the sound of the trains sliding past like steady breath. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm, one that didn't need fixing. At Emily's place, the days hummed with the clatter of tools and laughter that came easy. The kids worked in pairs, learning how to change oil or replace a tire. Ethan moved through the bays like he was born to it, patient and loud at the same time. Emily spent her days between city calls, grant papers, and the occasional scolding when someone left a wrench in the wrong drawer. She carried her mother's grace and my stubbornness, and somehow made both look like strength. Sometimes I watched from my corner chair, feeling time pass in slow circles. The sound of ratchets and engines filled the air, and I found myself smiling without meaning to. There was nothing left to prove. Only the comfort of knowing the world had moved forward without breaking. Nights were quieter. I'd sit by the window, the pocket watch ticking faintly beside my notebook. That old watch had been through fire and time and still managed to keep what mattered. I'd write to my wife before turning in letters she would never read, but I kept writing anyway. That night I wrote the last one. I told her our girl had come home not by crossing the distance, but by seeing it clearly at last. I told her the garage bore her name now that laughter had filled the space where regret once echoed. And I told her I was tired, but at peace. Before bed, I walked through the small room, straightened a framed photo of the three of us, and turned off the radio. The song that played lingered for a moment, a melody about second chances, fading into the hum of the night. I placed the watch on my chest and let the sound of the rain against the window lead me to sleep. When Emily found me the next morning, sunlight was creeping across the floorboards. The mug still sat by the chair, half full, and I must have looked like I'd just dozed off. The nurses later told her I went quietly, heart-slowing, the way old engines do when they've done their work. She didn't cry at first. She sat beside me, her hand resting over the watch, and whispered something no one else could hear. After a while, she stood, made herself coffee, and called Ethan. There were arrangements to make, but she moved through them steady, almost calm, as if she'd been expecting peace to look exactly like this. A few days later, she went through my desk. Beneath tools and papers, she found the drawer I'd been feeding for years. 6 birthday cards, one for each year we'd been apart. Each sealed, each signed with the same line. I hope you're happy. Love, Dad. She read them all sitting on the floor, knees pulled tight, tears leaving small circles on the paper. Each card told a different season of my silence, anger, softening into patience, giving way to forgiveness. By the last one, the ink had steadied, like my hand finally knew peace. That evening, she went back to the garage. The sun was setting low, turning the dust in the air gold. The kids had gone home, and only the sound of the wind moved through the open doors. She picked up my old wrench from the shelf and turned it over in her hands, the steel worn smooth where my fingers had lived for years. She climbed a small ladder and hooked it on the wall above the main bench, right where everyone could see. Beneath it, a small plaque read simply, Thomas Hargrove, builder, father. When the kids asked later who I was, she told them about a man who fixed engines and mistakes with the same quiet patience. She didn't mention the fire, or the years we lost, only that some truths take time to find their way home. The town changed in small ways after that. More kids came through the garage, more hands learning the rhythm of work. People left coffee on the porch of my cabin sometimes, as if I might still be there to drink it. The sign outside faded under the sun, but every spring, Emily had it painted again. Built on second chances. One night after closing, she locked the doors and stood under the porch light. The street was empty. The scent of rain carried through the air, mixing with the faint hum of engines cooling. A train passed beyond the trees, its horn long and low, rolling steady across the dark. She turned her face toward the sound, the pocket watch glinting faintly in her hand. The hands had stopped, long ago frozen in the moment I left, but she still wound it every morning, the motion more memory than habit. For a while she listened the night holding still around her. Then she smiled, small and sure, the way her mother used to, when things made sense again. She slipped the watch back into her pocket and looked once more at the sign. The porch light flickered, then steadied. The town exhaled with her. The train faded into the distance, leaving only wind, the smell of oil, and the soft hum of a world that kept on mending itself one heartbeat at a time.